Hello, and welcome in this second short video about decolonizing research. In this session, we will explore what decolonizing research may mean and look like in practice. We have seen in the previous introductory video what does decolonization mean in general, but in this session, we will explore it a little more further in the context of research. So in this session, we will be unpacking what decolonizing research may mean in its historical and contemporary landscapes. We will also try to reflect on the concept of positionality to decenter researchers' gaze, as well as issues of power embedded in research. And finally, it is important to develop critical reflexivity to challenge and interrogate our assumptions, values and beliefs in research, and how our actions and praxis have an impact on those we work with. These are some reflexive questions which you are welcome to take away as part of your private learning and reflexivity beyond the scope of this video. So the first question is, what do I believe about the ultimate purpose of decolonizing research? How can I center reflexivity in research to avoid perpetuating otherness? And how do I reflect upon my positionality, decision-making, and methodological choices to avoid harm, dehumanization, and violence in research? So a question which we may ask is, why do we need to decolonize research? Indigenous Maori scholar activist Linda Tuhiwai Smith wrote in her seminal book, Decolonizing Methodologies, that the word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the indigenous world's vocabulary. When I first read the statement, I was quite shocked to know that research, which is supposed to be conducted in a systematic way and with respect to individuals, involvement can be seen as something quote unquote dirty. Obviously, I had to unpack what that meant and why it is so specifically within indigenous communities. Reading Linda's book and other scholars working in the field of decolonization and decolonizing methodologies, the term research is conflated with the European colonization, imperialism, and the Enlightenment project to the quote-unquote colonized. It represents trauma, it represents violence and dehumanization to historically oppressed communities. So it was quite surprising for me to discover this, as I was not taught nor introduced this facet of research praxis during my MSc, for example, or my PhD training. So we need to be exploring the intersection of colonial legacies, imperialism, and research, specifically how they are embedded in knowledge production and disciplines in general. Decolonizing research is a way to restore and reclaim control over the histories, lived experiences, and ways of knowing of historically oppressed communities. So what is decolonizing research? Indigenous scholar Smith, 1999, explained the term decolonization as a process for conducting research with indigenous communities that places indigenous voices and epistemologies in the center of the research process. In this article, the author uses the term decolonization according to indigenous scholars. Danzin et al. 2008, that decolonization is a continuous process of anti-colonial struggle that honors indigenous approaches to knowing the world, recognizing indigenous land, indigenous peoples, and indigenous sovereignty, including sovereignty over the decolonization process. The author argues that decolonization is an ongoing process of becoming and learning and relearning regarding who we are as researchers, as educators, and taken responsibilities for participants. So in the context of this discussion about indigenousness and decolonization, decolonizing research is a process which centers the lived experiences, histories, and voices of indigenous communities. It is about relocating power and decentering researchers' gaze and challenging researchers' values, assumptions, biases, methodological choices, and categorization or categorizations to honor the people that we are working with, the land, the voices, and earth. Decolonizing research is a process of reflexivity, so it requires lots of unlearning, self-examination, and unpacking what we usually take for granted in research. After having a brief look at what decolonizing research may mean in the context of working with indigenous communities, let's unpack a little bit further what this may mean and look like in practice. So we will be focusing on these three concepts, which in my view are central to decolonizing research: positionality, power, and misrepresentation. And I do encourage you to explore these concepts a little bit further in the context of your own research and discipline beyond the scope of this session. So let's start with positionality. So what is positionality? Positionality refers to the stance or positioning of the researcher in relation to the social and political context of the study, the community, the organization, or the participant group. The position adopted by a researcher affects every phase of the research process, from the way the question or problem is initially constructed, designed, and conducted, to how others are invited to participate, the ways in which knowledge is constructed and acted on, and finally, the ways in which outcomes are disseminated and published. So positionality matters in decolonizing research. Researchers are encouraged to decenter their gaze and reflect upon their positionality and identity, which, by the way, are shaped by a set of values, beliefs, assumptions, and biases. We all have those, and they all influence our decision-making or methodological and ethical choices, knowingly or unknowingly. So how do we reflect upon our positionality in research from a decolonizing lens to ensure that our intentions, actions, and impact do not dehumanize or create harm or on communities we work with? Again, reflecting on our positionalities and identities as researchers is an ongoing process. It is not a tick box exercise. So I do encourage you to consider this as you journey through this process of decolonizing research. We as researchers have a privilege, so it is important to recognize our privileges and utilize them to ground our research in care, inclusivity, love, and collaboration. The next concept to unpack is about power. Power is central to decolonization and decolonizing research. So I have a quote here by Foucault: "What we know and how we know are grounded in shifting and diverse historical human practices, politics, and power. They are in the production of knowledge, multiple centers of power in constant struggle through conflict, compromise, and negotiation. Whichever group is the strongest establishes its own rules on what can be known and how it can be known." So researchers have the power to name, frame, analyze, research, produce knowledge, recommend, and so on. But it is important to ask, who embodies power in research, who should have access to power, and how can power be relocated so that whoever is involved in the research has a voice to shape the research project until it is completed. Therefore, it is important to reflect on power dynamics in research and between the researcher and the quote-unquote researched to create spaces for growth, liberation, and learning. Again, we researchers have privileges and power. So how can we use them to be a catalyst of change and conduct research equitably and respectfully, free from dehumanizing and colonial ideologies and attitudes? So to start doing this and put it into practice, these are some of the questions which I invite you to consider as part of decolonizing research. You are very welcome to add new questions, to challenge some of the questions as you journey in this process. So who frames the research scope? Whose research is it? For whose benefit? Who does it serve? How is research conducted? Is the research ethical? Who narrates, writes up the research? From which dominant lens are we researching from? How will research be disseminated? And overall, how is power manifested throughout the research process? The other thing which I would like us to highlight is representation. And I do encourage you to link representation to misrepresentation. It is important to remember that there is lots of misrepresentation in literature, in scholarship, and media, and that is the result of power and popular culture. So it is important for us as researchers to be responsible, ethical, accountable when dealing with quote-unquote data and information we have about participants. It is important to encourage dialogue with participants even before, during, and after field work is being completed, to be collectively engaged in how quote-unquote data is analyzed, interpreted, and reported. I invite you to read this extract from Chilisa's book that is titled Indigenous Research Methodologies, which outlines the misrepresentation of African communities being portrayed by Western anthropologists. So I'll give you a couple of seconds to read the quote. So what I'm reading from this quote is the power dynamics here. It is about centering the anthropologist's gaze, dominant gaze, to generate false representations about African communities. And Chilisa refers to it as deficit theorization. So that's in itself problematic. So undertaking research from a decolonizing lens, we need to ask ourselves critical questions to avoid perpetuating dehumanizing and oppressive views about the others. Decolonizing research is all about care, reflexivity, and partnership with those being engaged in our research. Chilisa invites us to consider the following questions with regard to the quotes, which I have shared in the previous slide. What is our role as researchers when we come across such literature on techniques? Have research methods changed, or have they maintained Euro-Western perspective? And how can we as researchers reconstruct the past and modify the body of literature? These are very important questions to consider. And I forgot a question mark here. And again, these are some of the questions which I have introduced you to earlier. Again, what is your starting point? What do I believe about the ultimate purpose of decolonizing research? How can I center reflexivity in research to avoid perpetuating otherness? How do I reflect upon my positionality, decision-making, and methodological choices to avoid harm, dehumanization, and violence in research? And this is a quick summary of this video. Research is not a neutral or objective space. It is guided by a set of values, beliefs, and assumptions. So whose values, assumptions, and beliefs are we perpetuating? How do they shape the research process, the knowledge we produce, our writing and representation of communities? Very critical questions that we need to consider. And the second point, decolonization is an ongoing process of unlearning, becoming, and healing, which mutually involves the former colonizer and colonized to reach social justice, equity, and emancipation. And thank you so much for watching and listening.